Hi everyone, my name is Martin Luther and I am a German religious leader. I was born on November 10th, 1483 in Eisenbahn, Germany. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about why I am one of the most significant figures during the Protestant Reformation era in Europe. As a 16th century theologian and monk, I have made many contributions into setting a structure of Christianity in the modern era. I want to tell everyone about why I am the ideal candidate in this election. Note that my opponent is the Roman Catholic Church, as they have strayed from traditional and conventional positions. Here I will explain a little bit about why I oppose the contemporary church practices. First, let me give you insight into what really goes on in the Roman Catholic Church. During the Reformation, the church sold indulgences. By purchasing an indulgence, an individual could reduce the length and severity of punishment that heaven would require as payment for their sins, or so the church has claimed. Now, my issue with this is that it's completely and 100% wrong. Not once does it even mention indulgences in the Bible. This got me so fed up, so much that I even wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Mainz explaining my frustration. On October 31st, 1517, I wrote a letter to the Archbishop, who was a member of the church who had authority to sell indulgences. Here, I wrote this letter out of desperation, asking the Archbishop not to stray from the path of God. I further explained why selling indulgences was morally wrong of church officials, as I was tired of watching them condone these acts, saying that heaven had a price over its head. I am a true believer of Christ. I know that salvation is obtained through faith alone, not by a piece of paper. In this letter, I warned the Archbishop that St. Peter's is selling indulgences under his name. Not only does this make people believe that buying these indulgences, they can save their loved ones from purgatory, but it strays them from knowing that people must work out their salvation for themselves. For people to think that if they murder someone, they can get away with it by just buying a piece of paper is so wrong. Heaven has no place for such a facade. Here I lay helplessly as I ask the Archbishop for help to change the ways of the church before it's too late. Now, this brings me to my slogan, salvation through faith alone. As your candidate, I will carry my beliefs for all to hear. I speak on behalf of God and his vision for our society. This slogan is meant to have an emotional appeal to your religious side. God's words say that we are saved by grace through our faith in Christ. Through grace alone, God will love us, God will forgive us, and God will save us. Not because of who we are or what we have done, but because of the work of Christ. Now that brings me on to my next point. On October 31st, 1517, I wrote the 95 Theses, also known as the Disputation of Power and Efficacy of Indulgences. In this document, I list 95 questions for debate against the Roman Catholic Church. The main gist of it was saying that the Bible is a central religious authority and that people can only reach salvation through faith alone and not by their deeds. Now, I want everyone to know that in this document, I displayed my discontentment with the church's sale of indulgences. Not only should the church not be allowed to sell indulgences, but the Pope has no authority to sell them as he has no power over purgatory. Now, let's talk a little bit about the story of me nailing the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Castle church door. In an article by Billy Pirogo in the Time magazine published on October 2017, he states that the story probably didn't even happen. The story was created as an apocryphal addition to make the story stick more. In fact, the story was created nearly 30 years after I wrote the 95 Theses, so it is unlikely that it even occurred. I also never even mentioned the story before the first Reformation anniversary of 1617. Now, this isn't saying that I didn't write the document, it's just saying that I didn't nail it to the church's door in such a dramatic way. Nevertheless, the 95 Theses was a significant document that represented my request for dispute, which in turn sparked a religious revolution. Not only did it reach out to so many people to a greater physical extent, but in a spiritual extent as well. Here I claim that the Pope has no power to forgive a person's sins. He only has power over church law, and as a result, indulgences should be considered useless. Now, this brings me to my opposing candidate, the Catholic monk of the Roman Church. He represents everything wrong with the church. He believes he's above absolute law, and I'm here to say that no one is above the power of God. I wrote a letter to George Spalaton in Wittenberg in January of 1514, and in this letter I talk about the church and the case of Johannes Reuchlin. How Reuchlin is being prosecuted without reasonable cause. The church is always disregarding reasoning that doesn't align with theirs. And this is preposterous. In the letter I wrote, I explained how Reuchlin did not intend to disrespect the church, but just to raise reasonable questions. And this compares to my own theology, as when I raised similar questions, I too was accused of heresy. Now, how can the church be so blinded by their own self-preservation that they do not see their stray from traditional values? As their candidate, let me tell you guys a little bit more about myself. I went to the University of Erfurt, where I got my master's degree in 1505. After attending this university, I then proceeded to attend the University of Wittenberg. Here, I got my doctorate degree and became a professor of biblical studies. Now, my theological studies implicated me to raise certain questions. Using my education, I made a choice to make a German translation of the Bible. Now, the German translation has been done before the Middle Ages, but I contributed to the first full text site translation of the Bible into German, which made use of the original Hebrew and Greek texts, not just the Latin Vulgate translation. So, for the first time ever, common people were able to read the actual text for themselves instead of just relying on what the priest told them, it says. Now, my translation of the Bible was a milestone on the path towards a unified German language. That, coupled with the printing press, was a major eye-opener for the general population. This was significant because it discovered that there were no mention of indulgences, purgatory, or confessions of sins to priests in the Bible. In fact, most of the Catholic rules and rituals were made up into the priesthood. The printing press was an invention that helped my translation of the Bible get across to everyone. It made it much easier for my ideas to disseminate, which allowed the revolt against the Catholic Church to spread in ways it couldn't before. Now, Johannes Gutenberg was the one who invented the printing press, and let me tell you more about him. There's a podcast called Gutenberg's Indulgence from the Informational School of the University of Washington, and this podcast was written by an associate professor named Joseph Janes. Here he discussed how textbooks tell us that Gutenberg is famous for printing the Bible, but on the contrary, what most textbooks fail to tell us is that he also printed out indulgences, which in turn made money for himself and the Roman Catholic Church. You see the connection here? Now, nevertheless, as a candidate, I will do everything in my power to make sure everyone has equal access to the Holy Bible, regardless of class, because no one should be excluded from the words of God. Now, this brings me on to my next point, my stance on equal access of education for religious purposes. I believe that everyone, especially women, should be able to read and write to truly understand the Bible. Now, before this time, women didn't have the option to get an education, but that has to change. I wrote a book called Luther's Letters to Women in 1856, where I wrote to different women in my life. In one letter I wrote to the Duchess Elizabeth of Brunswick, I wrote about women's education, or their lack of. And here I urged each town to have a girls' school where girls could have the opportunity to learn to read the gospel. Universal education is vital in keeping our economy efficient. Universal education will provide economic prosperity for all. I plead for educational efforts for both genders solely for religious purposes. Well, this brings me to the end of my campaign commercial. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to campaign. I hope I can count on your vote for this election. I believe that if you vote for me, Martin Luther, we can all live prosperous lives under the power of God. Thank you.